No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
Why do people commit themselves to the things they do? Why are people so worried about sport? Why wine? Why video games? I'm Brian Lowry, and in this season of my podcast, Know What You See, I'm asking a simple question, but a really big one. What's the point? In conversations with people with a variety of passions and obsessions, we get the chance to look through a window and see what it means to truly focus on a realm of human experience. Join me on Know What You See. New episodes begin November 26th.
Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged episode with Dr. Francis Collins. I feel like a great privilege talking to Dr. Collins, one of the most important scientists, perhaps, of the last century. He served as the head of the Human Genome Project early in his career for the federal government. Years previously, he was in an appearance on a live show that we did out in Malibu, California. And Dr. Collins spoke of how the decade-long Human Genome Project was crucial because there was a competing for-profit endeavor to map the human genome, and he desperately wanted his team to beat them so that this knowledge could be in the public domain. Then later he went to become the head of the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, the largest scientific research budget toward health of any in the world. So he's a remarkable, gentle scientist and human being, while at the same time being a straight talker. Grateful for this wonderful conversation on his new book. Enjoy. We are most delighted to announce that we're taking No Small Endeavor on the road this April. We'll be bringing our acclaimed variety show to cities across the country with special guests like Malcolm Gladwell, the New York Times bestselling author of The Tipping Point, and award-winning musician and songwriter Drew Holcomb, along with a killer band from Nashville. It will be a most outstanding evening of music, conversation, and big ideas. We'll be in Indianapolis, Louisville, Grand Rapids, Baltimore, Greensboro, Columbus, and Reading. I would love for you to join us. Details and tickets at nosmallendeavor.com/events. Again, that's nosmallendeavor.com/events. Dr. Francis Collins is a physician scientist. Under his direction, the Human Genome Project produced the first finished sequence of the human DNA instruction book in 2003. From 2009 to 2021, Dr. Collins served under 3 U.S. presidents as the director of the U.S. National Institutes of Health, the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world. His contributions to science, medicine, and society have been recognized by the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the National Medal of Science, and the Templeton Prize. And today we're discussing his most recent book, The Road to Wisdom. Dr. Collins, welcome.
Hey, please call me Francis if I can call you Lee.
Yes,
and it's
indeed.
Nice to be with you again.
It's great to be with you again. It's really nice to see you. And I wish that everybody listening could hear you also play guitar and sing like you have on one of our live shows. So it's a very, very fond memory of getting to be with you.
Fond memory for me, too, what you did with tokens and having some amazing mix of speaking and singing and everything else.
Yeah.
I had the privilege last night of being with a bunch of people singing Christmas carols where I was the orchestra, and it was just so soul-lifting to be able to step aside from all of the other things that are happening and just sing about it.
That's delightful. Yeah, we had a show here in Nashville, a live show in Nashville at the Skirmerhorn Symphony Center downtown, and we talked some about the singing together in Mass, and we actually had several minutes of a couple of thousand people singing together. It was pretty marvelous.
Oh, yeah.
So
you know, you can't really be mad at somebody you're singing with them.
Indeed. It does cut through a lot of that. So, thanks again for being with us. So, why, nearing the end of your illustrious career in science, a book on wisdom?
Yeah, why indeed? Well, I've had the privilege, Lee, of being in a remarkable set of scientific leadership roles, overseeing the Human Genome Project, over that remarkable adventure of reading out our own instruction DNA book for the first time, and then serving as the NIH director under 3 presidents, managing the largest support of biomedical research in the world, an amazing engine of discovery called NIH. But I had to watch and see some of the things that were happening, both in terms of science and the growing distrust in it, but also what's happening to our society. And these things are kind of linked together. a general sense of growing cynicism and skepticism, and also divisiveness, where our people seem so much having trouble actually integrating their conversations outside of their own bubble. And watching how this played out from my perspective as the NIH director during COVID, it was heartbreaking to see how it was really interfering with the ability of many people to tell the difference between what is actually factually based and what might not be. And the more I looked at our situation, I could see that this whole deterioration in our ability to discern truth had started a while ago, but it was accelerating in the course of COVID, just when we most needed to be able to understand what's a fact and what's a conspiracy. And I just felt, if there's something I can do here to try to help with some insight into what happened to us, I should try to do so. I didn't really want to write this book. I sort of felt like it was going to be a hard one to put down on paper. And who am I anyway to try to encourage the general population out there to rethink their stance about something like wisdom? But ultimately, after much encouragement from my spiritual mentor, the late Tim Keller, who was somebody I was very close with, who kept saying, you should try to do this. I couldn't say no. So if you didn't like the book, you can blame the late Reverend Keller.
No, I would be thanking Reverend Keller, indeed. Yeah. So as you've already noted, and you foregrounded as well in the book, the kind of social tensions, divisions that we're experiencing now, and that you certainly experienced as the head of the NIH. And a reminder to listeners that you at that time were Dr. Anthony Fauci's boss at the NIH.
That's right.
And so you all were experiencing a lot of these societal pressures very personally. So to share with us just kind of a glimpse of what was that like during that very intense season for you personally to be navigating these sorts of pressures?
The year 2020 was just an astounding one for all of us. It certainly was for me. That virus emerging in the early days of January 2020, and it became clear that this was going to be a serious worldwide problem. And it became the worst pandemic in more than a century. As the director of the NIH, it was my job to try to pull together every kind of scientific resource, build partnerships with industry and advocacy, community groups, and try to say, what can we do about this? And Lee, looking back on it, for the first few months of 2020, it did seem like we as a country were kind of pulling together here, recognizing that this was really frightening as the virus began to spread and people began to die. And we saw those terrible images of trucks pulling up to the morgue to handle the bodies that were too numerous to be able to be taken care of in the usual way. But then along the way, something started to get frayed in our trust of public health. Public health made some mistakes. The initial testing was not successful. The recommendations about whether or not to wear a mask had to change as we learned more about the virus, but people didn't understand why they had changed and began to think, these people don't know what they're talking about. And then various characters began to fill up the social media airwaves with other kinds of claims. Some of those were just misinformation. Some of them were intentional disinformation. And politics got involved. And gosh, by the fall of 2020, our country, facing a common enemy, was not responding as a country would hopefully do so. And I began to really be fearful that we were coming apart. But then the vaccines, which had been the biggest push for me and many of my colleagues during those first 11 months of 2020, actually succeeded in a way that was vastly better than we had hoped for, with these rigorous so-called phase 3 trials showing 95% effectiveness and very little in the way of side effects in 30,000 people that were tested with each of these mRNA vaccines. And there, Lee, I thought, okay, we've had a really tough year and a lot of people have died and a lot of people are really upset and have been put through all kinds of awful things with closure of businesses and schools. Now we're going to be okay. And the vaccine started to roll out and it felt like we were maybe okay. But then by the time we got to the summer of 21, 50 million Americans said, no, I don't want this. I've heard things that make me uncomfortable about whether this is really safe and whether it's going to be effective. And I'm just going to stand back and hope for the best. And the saddest of all possible statistics is what happened next, which is, this is Kaiser Family Foundation's analysis, that 234,000 Americans died unnecessarily between the summer of 21 and the spring of 22 because of this skepticism about whether the vaccines were something they could trust. So it's one thing to say we had a divided society and we were having some difficult conversations. People were dying in very large numbers. This is like 3 jumbo jets crashing every day for 9 months. That's what was happening. And it was all preventable.
When you look back on the distrust, the arguments, some people not being able to make sense of who to trust, what the truth is, given studies that have been done after the pandemic, what are statistics or studies that stand out to you as some of the most important that people ought to be aware of?
Yeah. Well, you can look and see what were the relationships of other kinds of community perspectives and the willingness to accept or not accept the vaccines as something you'd want to have for yourself and your family. The group that was most likely to say no thank you were white evangelical Christians. I'm a white evangelical Christian. My faith is the rock upon which I stand. And to have that somehow emerge in this way, it's just heartbreaking to see. Although I think there's a history here of potential sense that science is not always working on behalf of particularly conservative Christians who've worried about that all along and may think of scientists generally as atheists, which is not true for 40% of us. So there was a backdrop there. Politics made a big difference. The resistance to whether or not to accept the vaccines was much stronger in people on the right than people on the left. That doesn't sound right, does it? Science and politics really are bad bedfellows. You don't want to mix those two together. I think when you mix science and politics, you just get politics.
Yeah. So in this discussion of truth, and you point to 4 pillars or 4 sources of wisdom in the book, with truth being one of them. And you make this provocative case that far left literary and sociological theories, which kind of see all truth claims as socially constructed, right? That this far left attempted debunking of truth has more recently informed the far right, and that as they began to debunk the truth and come up with the so-called notion of alternative facts. So that's a kind of fascinating, provocative argument. So spell that out for us a little bit more.
So yeah, I never took a course in philosophy, so I had to do a lot of reading about this to try to understand some of these trends. But yeah, this is postmodernism, which emerged most obviously in humanities departments of mostly left-leaning academic institutions. And the argument was that everything that we consider to be truth, in their perspective, is so influenced by culture and societal mores that are arbitrary that we should just admit that there really is no such thing as truth. That is a very incompatible perspective with science, I might say. I don't know any postmodernist scientists. I don't know how you could go to the lab and say, well, I'm going to do this experiment, but there's no real truth to discover anyway. It'll probably come out wrong, or if it comes out right, it'll be different the next day. That just doesn't work. Let's all sort of start with the firm ground here that there is such a thing as reality. And science aims to try to discover aspects of reality about nature. The idea that you can simply say there is no such thing to be discovered just doesn't work in that part of our effort to seek truth. But maybe for humanities, it was like, well, there is no absolutely correct way to interpret that painting or that novel. Nobody really knows what the author who wrote this 200 years ago was trying to say, so let's not try to argue that there's some absolute to be discovered there. That's fine. But then it began to migrate over into other areas. The scientists resisted it, sometimes in humorous ways. But ironically now, after something of this sort getting underway, very much on the left, it seems that the right is now in the position of having alternative facts. If there's a claim of some sort that a conservative doesn't like, then they seem entitled to say, well, that might be true for you, but it's not true for me. I try in the book to sort of point out when it is okay to say that and when it isn't. And particularly this concept of having such things as established facts. Basically, things that have been, over the course of time, discovered, sometimes by science, sometimes they're a matter of history, and validated repeatedly by multiple observers and confirmed in multiple ways. That becomes part of this cohesive portfolio of information that we as a society say, we can count on that. What Jonathan Rauch calls the constitution of knowledge. But now it seems fashionable to pluck something out of that set of established facts that you don't like and say, well, I just don't believe that one anymore. And the right, I'm sorry to say, has done a lot of that. Not that the left has skipped it over either. They may have started it. They haven't given it up at all. In fact, across the board, we're seeing sort of this attack upon the idea that there is such a thing as truth. A society that needs to flourish in the future is not going to get there by having all truth be arbitrary and depending on your particular state of mind.
Yeah. I mean, those are fascinating philosophical conversations. And I think that another kind of element in so-called postmodernism that in my mind seems helpful is that at its best, it kind of calls us to a sort of humility. That is that it's a sort of saying, there's been a lot of so-called objective truth claims that have been made in the past that then as we dig more and more, we find that, no, there were certain subjectivities to that and certain agendas and interests in those sorts of so-called objective truth claims that then led to the pain and damage of a lot of people. But then, as you say, those sorts of observations then began to grow and grow in larger and larger spheres. Another one that I'd be interested in, and I suspect I know kind of how you'll answer, but I think one of the things oftentimes that happens in the conversations is that there will be non-scientists who will say things like, well, even quantum mechanics now teaches us that something is changed by the subjective presence of an observer. How would you respond to folks who allege such a thing?
Yeah, that's a bit of a misuse of physics. I have a PhD in physical chemistry. My whole graduate work was on quantum mechanics. This is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which at very, very tiny scales, like an electron or an atom, turns out to have a real truth to it, that the effort to observe a system introduces uncertainty in the thing you're trying to measure. That does not fit once you get to the kinds of scales that we all live with every day. Some might say, well, Newton was wrong about force equals mass times acceleration. Well, tell that to the person who just crashed their car into a tree. It applied quite nicely there. It's only one has to say, well, in certain special circumstances where you bring in tiny, tiny scales or relativity, some of this breaks down. But for daily experience, Newton's laws are actually really good at telling you what's going to happen if you take a certain action. Yes. So I think Newton's laws still belong in that category of established facts, with a small caveat that we are talking about a particular kind of time and space scale. And if you were going to go to a different place, then there's going to be a footnote saying, okay, you need to take account of quantum.
Yeah. So back to the kind of growing distrust that we're seeing in the public with regard to the presumption that scientists will or will not work in the best interest of the public. You quote a 2022 Pew study that is down to 29% of U.S. adults who trust that scientists are working in the public good. And it seems to me that there are at least two levels of where some of this distrust makes some level of sense, in the sense that we are so glutted with information, and a typical layperson, scientific layperson, can get so many convincing arguments from different perspectives, right? It's like, well, which of these scientists or pseudoscientists am I supposed to trust on the one hand? And then on the other hand, there have been at least a few kind of tragic cases. Like I'm thinking, for example, of the infamous Tuskegee syphilis study that was a horrible abuse of the study participants,
absolutely,
in the name of public health. So, how would you help people navigate either or both of those sorts of reticence?
Yeah, it is hard. I think part of it is in any instance where you're getting some kind of information sent to you, really try to stop and take account of the source. If it's something that is particularly upsetting and makes you angry or fearful, be particularly skeptical about whether you're now being manipulated by a source that has some other agenda than your well-being. I think appropriately you should ask your question, is this a source that has a history of integrity? Whether it's a person or an institution, what's the track record here? What's their level of competence? Is this actually an expert who's done the work to dig deeply into an issue? If they're telling you that clinical trials are actually dangerous because of Tuskegee, which was a terrible example of medical research gone wrong, what really has happened since then to correct that? Are they giving you the whole story or just getting you worried and upset? And then what's their level of humility? We have a sort of paucity of humility in a lot of our sources right now, especially on social media. Maybe because, a humble statement doesn't get spread quickly. Have you seen humility go viral? I have not. But that ought to be something to look for. If you have a celebrity who suddenly becomes an expert on everything, telling you what to do about your diabetes when their expertise was basically being in a movie, be careful. This is probably not the kind of thing you want to be terribly trustworthy. That's an abandonment of humility. So all of those things ought to factor in, but that takes time. Yeah. And we are on a circuit now where the average time that somebody will pay attention to an issue has fallen to less than a minute. And so to actually require people to be more distinguishing, have a better filter, doesn't fit very well with the pace of our lives. One thing is to basically decide, are you wasting your opportunity for information by spending too much time on sources that traditionally don't have a great track record? And here I'm talking about social media. I am not a fan of social media, as you can probably tell, because during COVID, I think the worst things that happened that caused people to be really doubtful about any of the public health information were coming from social media. There were some from cable news too. So I've heard of churches, by the way, that are now encouraging people to go on a 28-day fast, not from food, not from water, but from social media. And everything I hear about it says after 28 days, many of those churches say, let's just keep the fast going. This is so much better than where we were. It's tough at first. You're like, oh, I'm missing out. And then you find, I've got more time to do things that I'd like to do instead of, 4 or 5 hours that many of us are spending every day doom scrolling through all of these kinds of commentaries that are really not good for us. Yeah. There's some value in there for staying in touch with family and friends, but boy, an awful lot of it seems really to be the opposite of what we would want to have for our own flourishing. So be very clear as you're trying to decide who to trust and what to trust. Where's it coming from? What's the likelihood that this is a source that you could consider as being reliable, valuable, useful for you, as opposed to just trouble?
Yeah. In last year, the Wall Street Journal had a editorial under the title that I'm sure must have been uncomfortable for you. It was entitled "Francis Collins Has Regrets, but Too Few." But in your book, you say, I have learned that a kind of admission of missteps can be the beginning of opportunity to find common ground. Honestly answering the question, what did you do that made things worse and that you now regret? that answering that question becomes the best antidote to distrust, grievance, and blame.
Yeah.
And so how would you answer that question yourself today? How do you respond to the Wall Street Journal, or how do you respond to your own question of, what do you look back and think you wish you had done differently?
Yeah, there's quite a lot. But that was an interesting experience. Let me sort of paint the picture of how that editorial came to be written. I'm part of a group called Braver Angels, which has been around now for about 8 years, started by a marriage counselor and a couple of his other colleagues who were concerned that our country needed marriage counseling, that the separations politically into different camps, different tribes, different bubbles, whatever you want to call them, was getting worse and worse, to the point where people weren't even able to listen to each other anymore. And they were likely to demonize people who were not in their bubble, and not just say they were wrong or misguided, but that they were dangerous and evil. You can see that has happened even more so since they started this in 2016. So Braver Angels brings people together on the opposite side of an issue. And I've been particularly engaged in their conversations about the public health response to COVID, because there are people who are very upset about how that was handled. I got engaged in a very public debate at a Braver Angels annual meeting located symbolically in Gettysburg. And my counterpart is a truck organization leader in Minnesota named Wilk Wilkinson, who is very conservative and livid about the way in which COVID public health responses were handled, which he felt did a lot of harm to his community, to his company, having to shut their doors, to his kids' schools, and so on. So we had, as an example of how to have this kind of a conversation in public, a public debate between him and me about whether COVID had been mismanaged. And as part of that, I felt, based on previous Braver Angels experiences, it really is important to not just defend your perspective, but listen to the other perspective and say, there's places where I don't think I got that right. So I was able to say, and I'll say now, that, there were things in the way in which we communicated about the COVID pandemic that sounded much more confident than they should have. We were studying every day an unprecedented pandemic with a virus we had not encountered before, and trying to make the best recommendations we could, and we in this case was CDC especially, and telling people what we thought they might want to do to protect themselves. But we made it sound like we were a lot more sure than we were. And I wish we had started every one of those conversations with a little preamble that said, this is an evolving situation. We don't know nearly everything we wish we did. From what we know today, we're going to give you the best ideas we can about how to protect yourself and your family. But it might be wrong, and we might have to give you a totally different recommendation in a month. Don't be surprised if that happens. We didn't say that. The other thing is, I don't think we took significant account of how different this pandemic was experienced in the heartland, where Wilk is from, versus the big cities where most of the really awful video films were being made of trucks pulling outside the morgue. We had a broken public health system, so we didn't really have a good means of finding out what was going on in rural communities. So it was a one-size-fits-all approach. And that really was not good for some parts of our country. And so those are the things I said. And Wilk, for his part, was willing to say he started out with all guns blazing on this issue, and then realized that this kind of angry attack was not solving anything. And he'd gone on to start his own podcast called Derate the Hate, trying to get away from all the animosity and the vitriol to a serious conversation about what lessons could be learned. So I think we both kind of modeled what we hoped we could have more of. That videotape of that discussion somehow attracted no attention for 6 months. And then it popped up somewhere that the Wall Street Journal got wind of. And they jumped on it and said, aha, well, Francis is finally admitting all the terrible things that he did, but there was a lot more he should have said. It's like, so that's not helpful if we're trying to encourage people to actually be honest about their own shortcomings. I have yet to see the Wall Street Journal writing an article about their shortcomings during COVID, and there were plenty.
Hey there, friends. If intellectually honest conversations pique your interest, or you simply enjoy having your mind changed, then you should check out The Gist, the longest-running and chart-topping daily news and commentary podcast. Hosted by journalist Mike Pesca, who frequently appears on MSNBC and the PBS NewsHour, The Gist covers everything from breaking news and politics to sports and entertainment, all from Mike's pragmatic, centrist point of view. Not to mention, you'll hear from guests like former Obama speechwriter Ben Rhodes, Massachusetts Congressman Seth Moulton, and Academy Award-nominated actor Jesse Eisenberg. My favorite part, after most interviews, Mike conducts, the guest says something like, "Whoa, you actually read my book." So go ahead, follow The Gist on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening now. What do you wish non-scientists knew about scientists?
I guess I wish they would know that we are people too, that we're not machines. We're not these extremely introverted, antisocial atheists hanging out in the lab, doing experiments just because they're fun. I wish they knew that most of us are motivated by a strong desire to make discoveries that are going to help people, make the world a better place. And that's how we got into science in the first place. I wish they knew that 40% of us are people who believe in God, and not just any old God, a God who answers prayer, a personal God. That's a surprise to a lot of people who assume that atheism is the main faith position of people who do science. I guess I wish they would also know about how hard this is, how much failure you encounter as a scientist. In my book, the very first few pages, I write about a spectacular research failure that almost caused me to quit. But that's part of the experience. Anybody who tells you they haven't failed as a scientist must not be working on anything very important, because you're always out there on the edge of what's possible, and your hypotheses turn out to be wrong, or your experiment plan was a failure. That's part of it. You have to constantly try to pick yourself back up. I think people ought to know also that most scientists are not motivated by money. Scientists in general, certainly in the academic sector, are not all that well off. It's nothing like being in Silicon Valley. You are doing this because it's a passion, it's a mission, it's what you feel like is your calling, not to try to make money, and most of the time not to really get much visibility either. I've been fortunate, just because of these roles that I was asked to take, to be one of the more visible scientists, but most are not. And they have their families, and their cars break down, and they figure out it's going to be a little hard to pay the bills this week. I mean, that's the nature of it.
Yeah.
They're kind of like everybody else.
It seems like, too, there's probably, I don't know how widespread it is, but just anecdotally, there seems to be a sort of lack of awareness of really what the scientific method is and how it works, which is, this sort of recurring testing. Yes. And that one scientist can be pretty excited to find the mistakes in another scientist's work. Oh, yeah. Right? That it's ongoing, that the scientific field itself is self-correcting in that regard. Is that fair to say?
Very fair to say, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think maybe in public view, there's this idea that the scientists kind of circle the wagons around a conclusion that they all just love for some other philosophical reason, and they're willing to just let it stand, even though it's not true. Boy, that is just not the way it works. As you said, there's nothing a scientist gets a bigger bang out of than disrupting what is considered to be an accepted conclusion and showing that it was wrong. We all aim to try to do that because we believe in the importance of having this coherent portfolio of knowledge, and you don't want things having been smuggled in there that turned out not to be true. So we're constantly checking and rechecking. Is that conclusion one that we can count on? Or did something go wrong in that experiment? Or worse yet, did somebody actually fudge the data, which happens rarely, but it does happen.
You, as we've already noted, your book on sources of wisdom here: truth, faith, science, and trust. And as you've already kind of indicated, perhaps a lot of Americans would not expect to see faith and science both in such a list as compatible and or complementary sources of wisdom. So talk to us a little bit. You talk in the book about how you yourself took a journey from atheism to practicing faith. What was that journey like for you, and some of the tensions that resulted from that?
Well, it was a journey that I proceeded kicking and screaming because it was not what I thought would be part of my life journey. But I was raised in a home where faith wasn't considered relevant. So I had no real foundation to rest upon. And by the time I got to college and then to graduate school, I just didn't see any point to that at all. So I went from agnosticism to atheism, thought that anybody was talking about something that couldn't be measured in scientific experiments. It just isn't worth the time. So I would have been pretty rude to anyone who wanted to have a conversation about God. But then I got a change of heart about what kind of science I wanted to do, and discovered that there were some really interesting things happening in life science that I kind of ignored. And with a rather large change in my professional pathway, decided to go to medical school. I entered medical school as an atheist. I left as a Christian. And it was the experience of sitting at the bedside of good, honorable North Carolina people who were facing the end of their lives, where I knew our medical interventions were not going to save them, and trying to imagine how I would handle that, and observing that those who had a strong faith seemed to be oddly peaceful, that I knew I would not be. And then I got challenged by one of my patients. On a particular afternoon, an elderly woman with really terrible heart disease, praying about the chest pain that she was experiencing, and then turning to me and asking, "Doctor, what do you believe?" Those 4 words, "What do you believe?" Even now, 47 years later, that's the most important question I've ever been asked. People listening to this, how would you answer that? And are you sure you've done the appropriate work to defend your answer? So I thought at the time I should say I don't believe any of it, but suddenly felt very thin in the face of this person whose whole life had been built upon her faith. For me to just say, well, I don't believe any of it, it wasn't just impolite. It suddenly made me feel like I have really skipped over putting any time into this. It would be dishonorable to say I have an answer when I haven't actually even started to ask the question. So that made me really uncomfortable. And I decided I need a stronger support for my atheism. I better look into this. I better read some stuff by atheists, and then maybe read some stuff about people who don't agree with that, and see who's got the better argument. And I started down that road, and I ran into the writings of one C.S. Lewis, the Oxford scholar from several decades earlier, who had also been an atheist and had a lot of those same questions. And over the course of time, to his shock, became, as he described it, the most reluctant convert in all England, becoming a Christian on the basis of not purely logical arguments, but a lot of it was right in that place. I thought, wow, that's possible? So yeah, with a lot of resistance on my part, because that was not the answer I wanted, I did begin to recognize that science itself had put in front of me all kinds of things that you could consider to be evidence for a creator. The Big Bang. The fact that the mathematics that I so loved as a student studying quantum mechanics actually work to describe matter and energy. Why should that be? The idea that if you're a physicist and you're trying to discover a law about matter and energy, you know you got it right when the equation is simple and beautiful. Why should that be? Ooh. And then we have this universe that's not just simple mathematically, but it has these constants that determine how those laws are going to work, like the gravitational constant. And if those are off by a tiny bit, like 1 part in a billion, the universe really doesn't work anymore as a place where anything interesting could happen. You're just going to have a lot of particles flying around and no complexity, which is pretty much necessary for any form you can imagine of life. wait a minute, who set those particular constants to be exactly what they had to be? So either you got to say there's an intelligence behind this, or you have to say there's an infinite number of other parallel universes that we can never actually measure or observe, and we just happen to be in the lucky one. Which of those required more faith? The creator God started to emerge as a pretty compelling option. But then I had to figure out, is this a God, a deist kind of God who set the whole thing in motion and then had something else to do? Or does this God care about me? Francis Collins? Really? Now, how can that be? Here's where C.S. Lewis got me in that very first chapter of his book, Mere Christianity. The title of that chapter is Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. What? I never really thought about that. I took for granted that there is such a thing as right and wrong. All of us do. And I also took for granted that I'm supposed to do the right thing. And I had to admit that oftentimes I didn't. But when I didn't, I made an excuse, which only proved that I actually believed I was supposed to do the right thing. Where does that come from? Evolution doesn't quite work. If you say this is all evolutionary wiring of our brains because it's helped us survive, then you have to come to the conclusion we've basically been hoodwinked. There's really no such thing as good and evil. I don't know any atheist who's really comfortable going to that level. It seems like there's something real here. And if it's real, and if I'm looking for a clue about a God who is not just the creator of the universe, but who cares about me, wow, here it is, right in my own heart. That got me. The other thing that got me was beauty, Lee, because for me, this rather, hard-edged guy about show me your data or I'm not interested in your conclusion, I would occasionally encounter these moments where I was lifted out of all of that by an experience of beauty, which for me was often music, giving you this strange sweetness, but also aching, some sort of longing for something beautiful that you couldn't quite put into words, and you wanted to have more of it, but it never lasted very long. What is that? A longing for something that maybe we're made for, but we haven't gotten there yet. So you put those together, the moral law and the appealing of beauty, and I couldn't explain either of those without having some larger significance of who the creator was. Then, of course, I had to figure out which faith that was going to lead me to, and I did a lot of that exploring through various world religions. And I almost hoped the answer wouldn't be Christianity, because it seemed like that would be the obvious one for a guy in the United States where that is still the most common religion. But then I met the person of Jesus, who I had assumed was a myth. And the more I learned, the more I realized this is what was missing. I was beginning to perceive a holy God. I was certainly perceiving increasingly an unholy Francis Collins. How were these ever going to get together? And there was the answer, in a way that no other religions really quite offered, who claimed not just to be a smart guy with a lot of wonderful teachings, but to be the Son of God, and who died on the cross in a way that provided that opportunity for me to have relationship with God. That's what I needed. And after 2 years of that long struggle, I could no longer resist. I couldn't prove that this was all true, but it became for me much more compelling than any of the alternatives. I couldn't look back because the ground behind me had already crumbled. I had to take a leap forward.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I'm fascinated with the ways that you have sought to develop friendships with people with whom you have such profound disagreement. So speaking here of your Christian faith, this fascinating friendship that you developed with one of the leading so-called new atheists, Christopher Hitchens.
Yes.
But yeah, describe to us, and for those who don't know perhaps Christopher Hitchens, maybe describe who he is and then what that was like for you to develop a relationship with him.
Christopher Hitchens, when he was alive, and he died about 10 years ago, was one of the world's most articulate leading public intellectuals, a prolific writer on almost everything you could think of, but particularly about politics and history. The person who could put words together on the written page or in an oral presentation that left you breathless with the way in which he could express a concept and paint word pictures, but also a very, very hard-edged atheist who, along with Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett and Sam Harris, became the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse and did everything they could, not just to say religion was misguided, but actually to say it was evil. And Hitch wrote this book called God is Not Great, which came out about the same time as my book, The Language of God. And so he and I got shoved together in various settings to supposedly have a debate. And let's be clear, he wiped the floor with me because, especially in front of a public audience, he was the master of the one-liner put down, usually all the while drinking scotch rather heavily and getting more outrageous as the conversation went on. But it was both sort of devastating and also really amusing. And I thought to myself, I got to understand how this guy ticks. So I reached out to him after one of those debates where he had been particularly rude and found that in a one-on-one conversation, he was actually quite delightful. He just shifted into a different persona when there was an audience. And I thought, I could learn stuff from this guy. He knows the Bible really well. So he's going to be pretty quick to put down any superficial explanation of faith. You're going to have to go a lot deeper. This is going to be iron sharpening iron. I learned from that in other situations. So he and I became friends, but mostly sparring about the issue of faith. And then he got cancer. He got a diagnosis of already stage 4 esophageal cancer. And I reached out to him and said, we have some new research in just that area where if we could actually get the DNA information from your cancer, we might be able to find a drug therapy that wouldn't previously be considered appropriate for this kind of cancer, but it might be just what you need. And he was all up for that. And so we got him into a trial. It got done. And sure enough, there was a finding that provided a new idea about therapy. Normally, esophageal cancer survival after stage 4 is a matter of weeks. He lived a year and a half. The last part was pretty rough. But during that year and a half, I spent a lot of time with him. I would come down to his apartment at the Wyoming building in Washington, D.C., looking out over the city as the sun was going down. And we would, in my case, drink wine, in his case, drink something much stronger, and talk about faith, but also about cancer and also about history. And he knew everything about everything. To hear him discourse about George Orwell or Thomas Jefferson was just like the kind of life course that I never got to have. And we became very close. And I never convinced him about faith being something that he would want to take on for himself, but he certainly modified a lot his hard-edged attacks against faith, and even wrote about that in his column in Vanity Fair. So, it was a good model for how to have a conversation with somebody who disagrees with you profoundly about a really important issue, but actually learn from each other. I learned a lot about how he had come to his perspective, and he learned about mine. And we ended up agreeing to disagree, but to be friends.
You noted a moment ago that you talk about this failure that you had in your first 9 months of doing research, and you kind of failure is one of the threads that kind of runs throughout the book of you talking about important to see the ways we can grow in wisdom through failure. I'd be interested to hear you just talk a little bit more about the ways you've seen your own life flourish out of failures. What have been some of the difficult failures you've had to process? And then what are things that you've learned through those?
Sure. I love the story about the young man who wanted to understand the source of wisdom. And he asked a lot of people, and they all said, go talk to that guy in the mountains who seems to know about this. So he goes and finds the master in the mountains and said, Master, please, would you please just tell me, what is the source of wisdom? That's what I want. And the master says, that's trivial. It's good judgment. And the young man said, well, okay, that sounds fine, but how do I get good judgment? The master says, oh, from experience. Well, how do I get experience? Oh, that's easy. Bad judgment.
Good word. Good word.
That so fits my life experience. I mean, starting with the first few pages of the book, that colossal failure of my first real efforts in molecular biology, where I spent 6 months trying to build what would have been a very exciting outcome of a recombinant DNA vector, and failed really to think about the way in which it might go wrong. Just sort of had this optimistic view. Well, I want it to work, so it'll work, right? No, nature is not like that. And that failure, which almost caused me to walk away because I thought, I'm just not cut out to do this, actually helped me in a way that success would not have, to think about all of the ways when you're undertaking a scientific project, you have to count the many ways it could all go wrong before you start, and be prepared for those so you don't waste another 6 months on something that's sort of doomed, which is what I did the first time. So I learned so much from that. And that's the thing about failure. You learn from it. It always hurts. I see young scientists now, and I know the first failure they have is just like an incredible blow. It's not like my experiment failed. It's like I failed. But to remind people, that's how you learn. That's how you develop skill. That's your bad judgment that led to experience, as the story goes. So yeah, that was an initial one. But my goodness, when I first was asked to run the Human Genome Project, I didn't know what I was doing. Coming to be a federal employee, overseeing a project that most of the scientific community was opposed to, trying to figure out what exactly did we need as far as the right science to make this happen. In some cases, making bets on things that absolutely flamed out and had to be somehow explained and apologized for. Before ultimately getting everything to start to work. People only see what came out at the end of that 10-year period. There was a lot of things along the way that made me want to cry. And a lot of times where I thought, okay, I better plan my speech when we have to admit we failed. Going on past that, certainly as NIH director, having the opportunity to start some exciting projects like on the brain or on precision medicine, those were exhilarating, but many of them got off on rough patches that had to be fixed. One thing I did learn in all of this is surround yourself by people who are going to tell you when you're doing something stupid. Don't be afraid to have your people who are reporting to you point out you have just failed as a leader, because that's a whole lot better than finding it out later. Yeah. Even though it's kind of a blow to your ego. You got to have an ego that's not out of its appropriate space, even though most scientists do have some of that. And then certainly during COVID, what I had to feel was somehow a personal failure for my team, and I'm a big part of that we weren't able to save all the lives that we should have. And all those people who died were good, honorable people who somehow our system of science and public health did not present them with the chance to be saved in a way that was understood. And that's on all of us.
Thank you for that. What are other favorite or crucially important go-to aphorisms for you that you try to live by? And again, the book is on kind of sources of wisdom, but what's the other kind of hard-earned wisdom that has been crucial for you in your life?
So what is wisdom anyway? I think a lot of times people, including me, thought of that as, well, just get your facts straight. Now, that's necessary, but that's not sufficient. You have to layer on top of that experience, judgment, common sense, and very importantly, a moral framework. Because science gives you information that you can trust, but it may not have any moral value at all. You have to figure out on top of that, is that something that we not just could do, but we should do? The difference between is and ought. that becomes part of wisdom. Yoda is the wisdom example. Spock is the knowledge example. And I love Spock, but sometimes you need a little Yoda in there too, if you're not going to make a big mistake. I guess a lot of my idea about wisdom for me as a person of faith is remembering that I have another source of strength that I can lean on when I don't really know myself what I'm supposed to do. Psalm 46, God is my refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. I've had lots of moments of trouble, especially during COVID, but other times as well. And knowing that God is my refuge and strength made it possible not to get so panicked that you just start casting about to make all kinds of decisions. Stop and think about whether there's a source of wisdom that's outside of yourself. Read the book of Proverbs over and over again, because that's pretty much all it's about, is wisdom and where it comes from. Trust not in your own understanding. I have to be reminded of that because as a person, particularly a scientist, it's tempting to just grab back control and say, I got this. And that's often when things go wrong.
Yeah. As we kind of get near the end of our time together, I was struck by this famous quote from H.L. Mencken that you have near the end of your book. For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And also Margaret Mead, you say this is perhaps apocryphal, but the quote is, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And so as we close, I would love for you to talk a bit, as you do in the last chapter of your book, about this kind of pursuit of a nuanced understanding of truth, right? But then what can that look like as we try to take seriously our contributions to our families, our communities, the country? What's your hopes in that regard?
Well, that is the hope. And I hope this book, it doesn't seem in the first few chapters like a downer, although it does provide a fairly sobering diagnosis of how we may have lost some significant anchors to truth and to science and even to faith. But the hope is there from all of our hearts that we can pull ourselves back to a place of promoting the kind of society we want to have. I don't think our politicians are necessarily going to be the ones to pull that off. Our media is so conflicting in many instances that I don't know that that's going to bring us where we need to be. The communities of faith, unfortunately, many of them have gotten caught up in more political messages than faithful messages. But what about all of us? A group called More in Common, which surveys the nature of society, would argue, and it's pretty compelling if you look at their data, that about 2/3 of Americans are not in the polarized extremes. They're in this exhausted middle. Some are on the blue side, some on the red side, but they're kind of disgusted with all the vitriol and the name-calling and the animosity and wondering, what happened to us? My plea is for those of us in that space, and that's a lot of us, not to check out, but to basically say, hey, wait a minute, what can I do to try to be a part of turning this back around? To move from saying things shouldn't be like this to saying, I shouldn't be like this. And the steps that could be taken are simple, but they are going to require some motivation. One is really to do a better job of filtering the information that's coming at us to figure out what's trustworthy and what's not. And there are ways to do that. And don't allow things that actually are hurtful and wrong to get smuggled into your own web of belief in a way that they get in the way of being able to make decisions that are going to be good for you and your family and your community. And the second thing is to really step away from this tribalism and say, I'm not going to limit myself anymore to just interacting with people who share my views on everything. I need to understand the rest of the country. There's a lot of people out there that have a very different perspective. They're not all bad. What's going on there? Reach out to somebody down the street who used to be your friend and now you barely talk to and say, hey, can we get back together? let's have coffee. I really want to listen to you. I'm not there to yell at you or shout at you or tell you you're wrong. I want to understand you and then really do it. Something we've kind of lost experience with, listening to a alternative perspective that we don't agree with without feeling the need to have an immediate snappy response. No, understand. This is what I've done with Braver Angels a lot. This is what I did with Christopher Hitchens. It enriches you, even though it's hard at first. If we could have a whole lot more of that and then take that from one-on-one conversations to groups, to communities, to decisions about who we want to have as our elected leaders, maybe there's some chance that we could take what is admittedly kind of a dark period in our country and start shining light on it again. Because that's who we are. That's who we've always been. America's had troubles before, but we've always kind of figured out if we want to be that shining light, that city on the hill, then we, the people, are the ones that can make that happen. And just like Margaret Mead said, that's the only thing that's ever really made it happen is a small group of committed people. Let's be those people.
Been talking to Dr. Francis Collins, who served as the director of the Human Genome Project, which first mapped the human genome, as well as director of the U.S. National Institutes of Health. We've been discussing his most recent book, The Road to Wisdom. Francis, thank you so much for your time and your service to our country and our communities and your time today. So thank you.
Well, Lee, thank you. It's been great having this conversation, and thanks for what you're doing with this podcast. The world needs to hear all of these messages even more than ever.
Thank you. Have you ever listened to an interview and wished you could ask the guest or ask me a question? Or maybe you have wanted to read a book by one of our guests but needed a little nudge. Well, here is your chance, the one you've been waiting on. We are launching the No Small Endeavor Book Club exclusively for NSC Plus members. Our first book is entitled The Fix: How the 12 Steps Offer a Surprising Path of Transformation for the Well-Adjusted, the Down and Out, and Everyone in Between, by our friend Ian Cron. And on March 27 at 7 p.m. Central Time, Ian and I will sit down for a live discussion where you can join in, ask questions, and be part of the conversation. Sign up for No Small Endeavor Plus for as little as $5 a month and unlock this and other great perks like an ad-free podcast feed and exclusive content. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com and click Join NSC Plus. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com, click the little red button that says Join NSC Plus, and get access to the first ever NSC Book Club. See you then. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Audrey Griffith, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.